Welcome to the Safe States IVP 360 training series. This short session titled Shared Risk and Protective Factor Terminology will help you understand and hopefully demystify some of the common terminology that different prevention practitioners use when designing, implementing, and evaluating injury and violence prevention programs. Hi, my name is Lindsey Myers, and I'm the Vice President for Social and Behavioral Health at the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. I'm a longtime Safe States member and a former past president of Safe States, and I'm so excited that you're joining us for this 360 training series. I've worked in the field of injury and violence prevention for about 18 years. I started my career working at local public health and injury and violence prevention for about 4 years, and then worked at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment for 13 years, where I oversaw our injury and violence prevention work there, and just have really grown an appreciation for the concept of taking a shared risk and protective factor approach to our work. The challenge is I've spent years talking about the shared risk and protective factor approach, and sometimes you run into challenges with partners who may be using slightly different language than you are. Public health loves its lingo and its jargon, and one thing that I've noticed is that it shifts over time. So while some of us that have been in the injury and violence prevention field for over a decade are very used to using terms like shared risk and protective factors to refer to our work, but other fields like chronic disease or maybe maternal and child health or other sectors like transportation or housing may really use some different types of terms to refer to their work, or you'll see funding announcements where different terms come out. And if you get at the heart of it, there's a lot of similarity and a lot of intersection in these terms. This course includes a glossary of terms, which is really great because it does give some consistent common definitions that are pulled from a variety of credible sources to help you as you go through the course sort of understand those nuances. But I am hoping today to just highlight a few of the terms that you're going to hear and really challenge you as you're thinking about this course to not get hung up on each individual term and what, all of the slight differences in the terminology and where that word comes from, and really get at the heart of how you want to build your strategy to impact injury and violence prevention around a specific factor that your partners might resonate with, even if they're using a slightly different frame than shared risk and protective factors. So please check out that glossary. There is another webinar series, I'll remind you which one at the end of this presentation, that really dives into the shared risk and protective factor approach and highlights how you can work on it and what this means and how you design your projects looking at this. But this session is just really to give you just a high level look at some of the terms you're going to come across and hopefully challenge you not to get hung up on those terms and really figure out how to move forward and get specific in our language. So here's lots of different terms. So I just want to start out at the very basic level, defining what we mean by shared risk and protective factor. This is the term that is going to probably resonate if you work with public health quite a bit. If you work with fields outside of public health, there may be slightly different nuances in how you talk about these things. So definitely keep that in mind. But a risk factor at the very base level is any attribute, characteristic, or influence at the biological, psychological, family, community, or cultural level that precedes and is associated with a higher likelihood of negative outcomes and decreases the likelihood of positive outcomes. So basically, a risk factor increases the likelihood of experiencing injury and violence prevention in our case, or a chronic disease, or some sort of adverse outcome. A protective factor is the opposite. It's an attribute, characteristic, or influence at the biological, psychological, family, community, or cultural level that precedes and is associated with the higher likelihood of positive outcomes and lessens the likelihood of negative outcomes. So it decreases the likelihood of experiencing injury or violence, a disease, etc. So when we really talk about a shared risk and protective factor approach, all we're saying is that we know across different types of violence and injury, and even broader than that, different types of disease outcomes, etc., have some of these risk factors and protective factors that they share. They're in common. And if you can identify the specifics about what those are, you will be able to sort of work in a way that might concentrate efforts on influencing one factor and having an impact on multiple outcomes all at the same time. So it's a really efficient use of our resources and our time, and it also is really great for building partnerships. And so that's all we need at a very base level. I think, what I hear over the years, that some of the terms have shifted, and a big one is adverse childhood experiences. So you're going to hear CDC, this is a priority of CDC's, for example. And so I want to define what adverse childhood experiences are for you, but then show you how these are really just basically risk factors, right? So these are risk factors that can influence injury and violence prevention and other health outcomes across the board. So the definition included in the glossary is an ACE is a potentially traumatic event that occurs in childhood 0 to 17 years of age, and includes examples like experiencing violence or abuse, witnessing violence in the home, or having a family member attempt or die by suicide. ACEs can also include aspects of a child's environment that can determine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as growing up in a household with substance misuse, mental health problems, or instability due to parental separation, or household members being in jail or in prison. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, substance misuse in adulthood, and we know that people who are experiencing some of these conditions in childhood also are at higher risk for different types of injuries. So both some of the ACEs themselves are violence related, for example, or risk factors, and also impact both injury and violence and chronic disease and other outcomes. So you can see that adverse childhood experiences are a specific type of risk factor. You can also, this is a little newer term that I'm starting to see in the vernacular, but, talking about positive childhood experiences. So sort of, things that might be going really well for in childhood, having good connections and relationships to caring adults and things like that, which are very, very similar than to what we might define in injury and violence prevention literature as protective factors. So I see personally adverse childhood experiences or positive childhood experiences as being examples of risk factors or protective factors. And those adverse childhood experiences or positive childhood experiences can, if you isolate and get down to the specifics about what we mean and not just use the kind of umbrella term to talk about the collection of factors, pick out individual things that are going to be tied to multiple outcomes at once. And that is basically a shared risk and protective factor approach. You also will hear a lot about social determinants of health, of course. This is a common term. A lot of the chronic disease programs that I've worked with over the years, when we first started talking about shared risk and protective factors, would say, we don't really work on shared risk and protective factors, but we do work on social determinants of health. And we're trying to take like a place-based approach to addressing chronic disease. And so then when you ask some questions around, well, what factors are you talking about specifically, you start to get to some specifics that can sound very similar to risk factors or protective factors that are known to the injury and violence prevention field, and also may influence adverse childhood experiences or be adverse childhood experiences. So social determinants of health are simply conditions and contexts in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship at an age that influence and affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes. So they can be just like risk factors, social, economic, or physical. They can include policies, systems, and environments. So for example, a social determinant of health can be the availability of resources to meet daily needs, things like safe housing, access to food, access to childcare, etc., can be things that are social determinants of health. And when you see, and you can look at these definitions and download this for yourself, when you read the definitions themselves and start to highlight some of the examples that are used in them, they're similar. So, sure, there's some slight nuances in addressing social determinants of health at the policy level and what that might mean at the, for structuring programs, but at the end of the day, we may be talking about the same thing. Very similarly, population health is also a term you hear quite a lot. And I always think of it as, population health is something that is trying to build not the individual health of individuals, but the health of the population. And you're looking at the geographic level, you're looking at health disparities based on race, ethnicity, and income level, et cetera. And it has three components: health outcomes, health determinants, which could be social determinants, and policies. So that, again, if you start to get to specifics, you can start to see someone who says, I work in population health, and you say, well, what specifically are you working on? And they say something like, I'm working to increase housing security. You could say, hey, that's also a potential positive childhood experience for having a stable, safe, stable, nurturing environment for a child, and a protective factor for multiple outcomes, including injury and violence prevention outcomes. So you may also hear the term social determinants of equity. So systems of power like racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, xenophobia, and economic systems like capitalism are examples of social determinants of equity. And you can see how these structural determinants really are underlying a lot of what we see then in population health when we look at disparities that are tied to social determinants of health and really drivers. So to me, some of the social determinants of equity really are sort of the big risk factors that you see for health outcomes across the board. And so again, like there's maybe some nuances, but if at a program level, if what you want to work on is, reducing risk factors associated with violence, you may want to choose something like dismantling racism as an ultimate risk factor that you want to do that, and trying to break away of that so that you can start to see strengthening in social determinants of health and positive experiences and building up those protective factors. Another term that I use a lot is, talking about we have to do upstream prevention. We have to go, to the fundamental social and economic structures that decrease barriers to improve supports and allow people to achieve their full potential. And so again, working on things like racism and social determinants of health and building, particularly at the systems and policy level, you will see that taking that upstream approach is pretty much going to encompass working on a lot of these types of initiatives and incorporate all of these terms. So in closing, I just want to say, all of this that I just talked about is, to me, taking a shared risk and protective factor approach. And while you may come from different fields and people will have some different perspectives on how to use the nomenclature, or a funder might use a particular term, if you really get at the specifics of what you're talking about, if what you're talking about is increasing food security for families, then you can, really focus on that and have people talk about the umbrella terms the way that they will. That has been really helpful for me in my career and in framing the work we do. I really encourage you now to check out the session titled Systems, Policies, and Environmental Approaches to Injury and Violence Prevention. Catherine Guerrero from Health Management Associates and a former colleague of mine does a really excellent job explaining what shared risk and protective factors are, what it really means to take a shared risk and protective factor approach when you're planning, implementing, and evaluating injury and violence prevention efforts. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the IVP 360 series.